This video is an overview of how to draft the research paper. The full presentation is available as a PDF. I'm just going to go over this in the interest of making it not too long, just some of the highlights of the presentation. So there's just some basic drafting tips here. Remember that you should review the information in Chapter 7 on avoiding plagiarism yourself. There's also information in Chapter 7 on using quotes, but this presentation covers some of the basics of citing and using sources. I also put some information in the drafting lesson on common knowledge. Make sure that you read that. One thing to keep in mind as you're writing this essay is that you're writing an argument. It's going to rely on reason. We covered that back on page 74 in the text. And logic, not emotions. So you're working on writing a logical argument that doesn't rely on emotions to get its points across. You have to use sources to prove the points, which is why we worked on the annotated bibliography first. And those sources are going to be scholarly, which is going to help you with your credibility. You must use critical thinking. And then finally, make sure you follow all the instructions for submitting the draft and the final paper. The draft is required. It has to be a complete draft. So keep this critical thinking list in mind as you work on your paper. So as you're working on this, you already wrote an argumentative essay in this class. So think of this one as an extended argument essay that's going to have more outside sources. You're going to organize it as an argumentative essay would be organized. You'll have my outline with your feedback, revise that outline if needed, and then go back in with your revised outline or with your correct outline and decide which sources from your annotated bibliography or which other sources you've located since you did the annotated bibliography are going to go into which section of your paper. Then add those sources to your outline. I'm only going to go over this briefly, but these are just some things that you can do in the introduction. One thing that you can think of is as you're writing your paper, you may not be able to write the introduction right away because you haven't written the entire paper yet. As you can draft the paper in the body paragraphs and then come back and work on your introduction. These are just some of the things that you can do. If you think your audience needs to be pulled in, but without a generic kind of hook, a question or a all throughout history, a big broad sweeping statement or truism, if there's some sort of short story or example or statistic that you can use that can introduce your topic to your audience, that's something good to do in the introduction. An overview of all the issues is always going to help. If you're writing about a topic where key terminology needs to be explained, the introduction is a good place for that. Any quotations or paraphrases that might show how controversial the topic is. Now these are like not quotations, general quotations you find on the internet, but quotations from your sources. Background information needed to help people understand the direction of the paper. Some people mention primary opposing views in the introduction. Or you can do a brief outline of the points covered in the paper. You don't have to do all of these things, but some of these things are going to help you, including at least some of these things will help you create an effective introduction to your paper. Remember that the introduction must end with a one-sentence thesis statement that tells what the overall focus. Remember, you're supposed to be focusing on a problem and identifying some sort of solution or plan. So your paper is going to prove that something's a problem and talk about solutions or a plan to correct the problem. The body of your research paper, which is going to be the bulk of your paper, is going to clearly present the main points of the paper. You're going to give strong examples, details, and explanations to support each main point. This will come from your support from your outside sources, but also your own explanations, connecting those sources to your ideas. You're also going to make sure that you address counterarguments and refute those arguments. I've included in the lesson this video again, the one about organizing a logical argument, strong logical argument. And make sure you use strong evidence from your sources. You can paraphrase, you can summarize, or you can quote, but you have to use those sources to support your ideas. The conclusion should also, it doesn't have to have all these things, but some of these things will help. You can restate your thesis from the introduction in different words. you can give a brief summarization of the point, but avoid going over 2 sentences. You don't want to repeat everything that you've already written. You can also predict what might happen if people don't embrace your position or don't accept your position or your proposed solution. You can also end with a strong clincher statement, which is an appropriate final sentence that ties the whole point of the paper together. And you may even refer back to whatever you did in the introduction. The works cited page will come after the conclusion, but it does not count in the word count in the page count of 68 pages. The works cited is a separate page in the document, but it's part of the same document, and it should have 5 sources with a permitted list of scholarly sources and government websites. You can't just list them in the works cited. You have to use each source at least once in your paper, either in a paraphrase or in a summary or in a quotation, at least once each. Here are just some additional tips. Thesis and main points first. You've got that in your outline. Another point, you don't have to start writing your paper with the introduction. Try drafting the thesis and body first and then go back and figure out how to best introduce the body and conclude the paper. Make sure you use transitions between main points and between examples within the main points. And always keep your thesis in the forefront of your mind while writing. Everything in this paper, every sentence and every word in your paper has to point back to the thesis somehow. You'll need to avoid plagiarism, and you'll need to use quotes and paraphrase appropriately, and you'll need to cite correctly in MLA. If you read Chapter 7 carefully, all this information is in Chapter 7, and I'm going to cover some of the highlights here quickly. Back in the beginning of the semester, I cautioned you all about using citation generators, and here's just some information from your book. There are many citation generators available online, and they seem really easy to use. You just click and there you are, there's your format. But sometimes these citation generators make mistakes. You can use them, but what you need to do is then double check what they give you before submitting. Okay, so make sure you check if you're using a citation generator, if you're cut and pasting a citation into your paper. Check it against the examples in Chapter 7 of our book to see that they're correct. I've also provided links to other places where you can check MLA citations. A checklist for avoiding plagiarism. This is really important. I'm going to give you the option to do a self-plagiarism check using the college's plagiarism tool. But that's not a guarantee. You have to make sure that you cite every quote, every paraphrase, and every summary, that you use your own words and structure in any paraphrase, and that all quotations include quotation marks. So you have to check, make sure that you always put quoted material within quotation marks, make sure you summarize in your own words and give source credit for every idea. Make sure that you paraphrase correctly. If you use someone else's idea, make sure you give credit even if you put it into your own words. Always put the exact words of other writers in quotation marks and add citations. And then common knowledge is covered here. I give more extensive information about common knowledge in the lesson on drafting, but you can also find some more information on common knowledge in Chapter 7 in our book. However, if you have even the slightest doubt about whether you should plagiarize or cite, make sure that you cite or send me an email and ask me a question. So you're using outside sources, and sometimes you need to decide whether you should quote the writer directly or whether you should paraphrase or summarize. Your book gives you some nice questions that you can ask yourself. When you see that you're planning on using a quotation, or you notice a quotation in your paper and you're deciding whether you should revise it to be a paraphrase, here are the things that you should consider. Is the quotation given because it is necessary for the reader to see the exact wording of the original? If a writer has written something so strongly or so in such a way that you would change the meaning if you changed the words, then you should use the quotation. If the language is especially engaging, the writers use really strong language that makes a strong point or would pull readers in, then you should use a quotation. If the writer is a respected authority, as your writers will be because you're using scholarly sources, then you should probably consider quoting instead of paraphrasing. Make sure that you incorporate quotes correctly. That means giving signal phrases to introduce them and to differentiate between your ideas and those of your sources. Make sure you explain them. Use long quotes sparingly and comment on them extensively. If you have a large block quote that's just taking up in your space in your paper, you're going to lose points for support because they're just there obviously as filler. If I quote an entire paragraph of a writer, then I need to make sure that I've included at least a paragraph of my own commenting on that. Make sure you format quotes correctly and review how to quote on page 293 to 294 of your textbook. You have to give quotes context. You have to lead into them and attribute them to sources, then connect them to your writing. Here's an example. Dr. Riley criticizes those who claim vending machines fund schools. She claims, no amount of revenue for a school justifies filling children with empty calories and robbing them of nutrition. She and other experts agree that vending machines have no place on school grounds. This writer did well. There's a repeat of the word claims, so she might want to think about looking at this handout to see if she could find another word to use instead of claim. You could say argues here, she writes, she states, but there is some repetition here. But overall, the writers provided some context for the quote, quoted correctly, cited correctly, and then explained it and made the connection to her own writing. For citations, you must cite an MLA. Again, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, don't rely solely on citation generators. Use the information on citing in text and in works cited in MLA from Bedford Handbook, from Chapter 7, or from the Al Purdue link. All of these links are on Blackboard for you also. Remember that the paper is 6 to 8 pages double-spaced. Do not include a cover page. If you do, it's not going to count toward those cover pages and you'll lose some points. Images, graphs, and charts will not count toward length. Long quotes used excessively. Extra spacing and spacing errors don't count toward length. So if you stick an image or a graph or a chart that takes up half a page in your paper, then your paper needs to actually be 6.5 pages long, not just 6. Long quotes used excessively. If it's clear you're using long quotes as filler, they're not going to count toward the length of your paper. You need to trim those long quotes down or comment on them more extensively yourself. And then if you put in any extra spaces, your entire paper should be double spaced. If you have extra spaces or you put your heading on every page, any formatting errors that artificially lengthen your paper are not going to count toward the length. Finally, let me know if you have any questions as you work. Be sure to follow the due dates for the draft and the final paper. They're listed in the lessons and in the research paper instructions.